Long before the pyramids of Egypt, before the legions of Rome, and before the kingdoms we know from history books, there was Sumer, the first cities, the first writing, the first laws, all born in a land many believed time had erased. Who were these mysterious people, and how did they shape the world we live in today? This is the forgotten story of the Sumerians, the nation that time tried to erase. Welcome, dear listener. Imagine yourself standing on the banks of two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, 6,000 years ago. The air is warm, the soil rich, and in the distance rise the outlines of the very first cities humanity ever built. This is where the story of civilization truly begins. In this series, we will journey together through the world of the Sumerians, their triumphs, their struggles, their ideas, and the echoes they left behind. Settle in. Let your mind wander gently back through the ages, and allow history to unfold like a calm river flowing through time. The story of Sumer awaits you. If you travel far back in time, long before the rise of Greece, long before the pyramids of Egypt stood tall, you would find yourself standing in a land cradled by two rivers. This land, nestled between the Tigris and the Euphrates, was later called Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning the land between rivers. It was here, thousands of years ago, that the story of the Sumerians began. And with their story, the story of civilization itself quietly unfolded. The land was not easy to tame. Summers were hot and dry, while floods from the rivers were unpredictable. Yet this stretch of fertile soil offered something rare in the ancient world, a chance to grow more food than a single family could eat. It was this simple, yet extraordinary possibility that set the stage for one of humanity's greatest transformations: the birth of cities, of organized society, and of culture as we know it. The Sumerians were not the first people to walk this region, but they were the first to build something lasting upon it. Archaeologists and historians still debate where exactly they came from. Some suggest they may have migrated from the east, bringing with them knowledge of farming and animal domestication. Others believe they were native to southern Mesopotamia, learning over generations how to survive in this demanding environment. Whatever their origins, by around 4000 BCE, their presence was unmistakable. They began clustering into settlements, and these settlements grew into something larger, communities bound together by shared fields, temples, and traditions. At first glance, these early villages may have looked modest. Houses were made from sun-dried mud bricks, shaped by hand and stacked to form simple structures. But hidden in this simplicity was innovation. The Sumerians were among the first to design irrigation canals, guiding water from the rivers into their farmlands. This system allowed them to cultivate barley, wheat, and vegetables in abundance. With irrigation, they not only secured food but created surpluses, harvests that could be stored, traded, or shared. And with surplus came specialization. Not everyone needed to farm anymore. Some became builders, some potters, some priests, and some storytellers. In this quiet revolution, society began to take new forms. Religion was central to their worldview. To the Sumerians, every aspect of nature, the rivers, the winds, the fertile earth, was alive with divine presence. They built temples, called ziggurats, rising step by step toward the heavens. Though the earliest ziggurats were not as monumental as those later built, they symbolized a new kind of relationship between humanity and the divine, organized worship within a communal space. The temple was more than a house of gods. It was the beating heart of the city, a place where offerings were made, festivals celebrated, and even grain stored. Life in early Sumer was tied to both survival and spirit, each feeding into the other. As villages grew into towns, names began to appear in history: Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, and Ur. Each of these would one day become a city-state, ruled by its own leaders, guided by its own priests, and defended by its own walls. Uruk, in particular, stands out as a marvel of the early world. By around 3100 BCE, it may have housed tens of thousands of people, making it the first true city in human history. Imagine walking through its bustling streets, merchants trading in clay tablets, farmers bringing their produce to market, children playing among the narrow lanes, and priests ascending the steps of the temple. The hum of human life, organized on such a scale, was something the world had never seen before. And yet, for all their achievements, the Sumerians lived in constant dialogue with the forces of nature. Floods could sweep away their fields, droughts could parch their canals, and storms could flatten their homes. Perhaps this is why their myths spoke of gods who were both generous and unpredictable. They told stories of Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who guided humanity with his cleverness. They revered Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose passions could shape destinies. And they feared Enlil, god of the air, who could bring either life-giving winds or devastating storms. To the Sumerians, the world was a delicate balance, and they were its careful stewards. Another quiet revolution was taking place at this time: the invention of writing. In its earliest form, writing in Sumer was not about poetry or stories, but about counting. Farmers and merchants needed ways to record their goods: sacks of grain, herds of sheep, jars of oil. They began by pressing marks into clay tokens, then symbols into clay tablets. Over time, these marks evolved into cuneiform, a script of wedge-shaped impressions that would one day carry the words of kings and the myths of gods. With writing, memory no longer depended only on the spoken word. Knowledge could be stored, carried, and passed across generations. Humanity had discovered a way to make time itself a partner in civilization. So who were the Sumerians? They were farmers, priests, artisans, and traders. They were storytellers who crafted myths, and innovators who invented tools. They were dreamers who looked at the flat plains of southern Mesopotamia and imagined something greater than survival. They imagined community, order, and meaning. And though their origins may be shrouded in mystery, their contributions were clear. They had laid the foundations of urban life. The dawn of Sumer was not a sudden burst of brilliance, but a steady unfolding. Over centuries, their settlements grew, their rituals deepened, their technologies multiplied. And with every brick laid, with every canal dug, with every story told, they shaped not only their own destiny, but the destiny of the world. For in their temples and their cities, in their myths and their writing, we see the first outlines of civilization: fragile, imperfect, yet enduring. This was just the beginning. The chapters that followed would see the Sumerians rise to greatness, face challenges, and leave behind a legacy so vast that even time itself could not fully erase it. Their story, like the rivers that nourished them, would continue to flow. When we think of the word classical, we often imagine a golden age, a time when a people or culture reaches its height of power, creativity, and influence. For the Sumerians, their classical age emerged slowly, like the sun rising over the flat Mesopotamian horizon. By around 3000 BCE, the scattered villages of the Dawn period had grown into great city-states, each with its own walls, rulers, and gods. These were not merely towns, but centers of human achievement unlike anything the world had seen before. At the heart of this transformation stood the city-state of Uruk. Often considered the world's first major city, Uruk had become a place of wonder. Its massive walls, said to stretch for miles, enclosed a population of perhaps 40,000 to 50,000 people, an astonishing number for its time. To walk through Uruk was to experience a new kind of human society: markets buzzing with activity, temples rising like stairways to heaven, and scribes etching records on clay tablets. It was a city of stone, mud brick, and spirit, a place where the energy of thousands of lives converged. But Uruk was not alone. Cities like Ur, Lagash, Eridu, Nippur, and Kish stood as rivals and neighbors, each proud of its own traditions and gods. Together, these city-states formed a network across southern Mesopotamia. They were bound by rivers and canals, yet often divided by ambition and rivalry. Each city believed its patron deity held supreme power, and its rulers often claimed divine favor. This devotion was not simply spiritual, it was deeply woven into politics and daily life. At the center of every Sumerian city stood the ziggurat, a towering stepped platform that reached skyward. These structures were more than temples. They were symbols of a people's devotion, labor, and unity. Building a ziggurat required thousands of bricks, each molded by hand, baked in the sun, and carried to the rising structure. When completed, a ziggurat dominated the skyline, reminding everyone that the city's life flowed from the gods above. Priests, who served as intermediaries, held great authority, not only guiding rituals but also managing the city's resources. In the early classical age, religion and governance were one. This was also a time of innovation and administration. As cities grew, so did the complexity of life. Farmers needed to know when to plant and harvest. Builders needed resources organized. Merchants required fair systems of trade. The Sumerians developed new methods to meet these needs. Their scribes recorded agreements, taxes, and inventories in cuneiform script. Clay tablets filled with lists of goods, numbers, and names survive today, silent witnesses to the birth of record-keeping. These early records show how trade extended far beyond Mesopotamia. Goods like timber from the Levant, metals from Anatolia, and precious stones from distant lands passed through Sumerian markets, enriching their cities and expanding their horizons. The economy of Sumer was vibrant and varied. At its foundation was agriculture, sustained by the irrigation systems that tamed the rivers. Barley was the staple crop, ground into flour and baked into bread or brewed into beer, a common and cherished drink of the Sumerians. Surpluses of grain allowed cities to support artisans, potters, metalworkers, weavers, and builders, whose skills gave the Sumerians not only practical tools but also beauty. Jewelry of gold and lapis lazuli, delicate cylinder seals engraved with intricate designs, and finely crafted pottery spoke of a people who valued both utility and artistry. Politically, the classical age of Sumer was dynamic and, at times, turbulent. Each city-state was led by a ruler, often referred to as a lugol, meaning big man. These rulers combined political authority with religious duty, presenting themselves as chosen by the gods to guide their people. In times of peace, they oversaw trade, construction, and rituals. In times of tension, they defended their city with walls and armies. Rivalries between city-states sometimes flared into conflict, as each sought to assert dominance. Yet, even in rivalry, they shared a cultural identity. The Sumerians spoke a common language, worshipped a pantheon of gods, and developed traditions that bound them together. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period was the rise of myth and literature. The Sumerians were not content with simple records. They began to inscribe their beliefs, stories, and poetry. The earliest versions of what would later become the Epic of Gilgamesh emerged in this age, telling the tale of the legendary king of Uruk. These stories reflected both the grandeur of Sumerian cities and the questions that haunted human existence. What does it mean to rule? What is the nature of friendship? What lies beyond life? Through these myths, the Sumerians gave voice to their deepest hopes and fears, leaving us with some of the earliest works of world literature. Social life in the classical age was layered and complex. At the top stood the ruling families and priests whose authority shaped public life. Below them were merchants and artisans whose skills sustained the economy. Farmers formed the backbone of society, tending the fields and ensuring food for all. Even enslaved people had a place in this structure, often working in households or temples. Each role was bound by duty, yet together they formed a society that thrived on cooperation and shared belief. The Sumerians also advanced in science and mathematics. They studied the movements of the stars, not only for curiosity but for practical reasons, such as guiding agriculture and rituals. They created a number system based on 60, which still influences how we measure time. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Their knowledge of geometry and measurement allowed them to design canals, construct buildings, and divide land fairly. What might seem simple to us today was revolutionary in their world, laying the groundwork for civilizations that followed. As the classical age of Sumer unfolded, the city-states flourished like stars scattered across the night sky. Each glowed with its own brilliance, yet together they illuminated the birth of organized civilization. Their achievements in governance, trade, religion, and culture became a model for the world. Even in their rivalries, the Sumerians pushed one another to greater heights, ensuring that their legacy would not be confined to their own time. By the end of this period, Sumer had become more than a collection of cities. It was a civilization, a complex, creative, and enduring society that shaped the human journey in profound ways. The echoes of their classical age resound in our daily lives, from the way we tell time to the stories we tell about ourselves. Yet, as history teaches us, no age lasts forever. Beyond the horizon, new influences were stirring, new peoples were arriving, and new challenges were approaching. The Sumerians would soon discover that the world beyond their rivers was eager to shape their destiny as much as they had shaped their own. And so, the story of Sumer would continue, into encounters, exchanges, and transformations that carried them into the next chapter of their history. No civilization exists in isolation. Even the greatest cities are touched by winds from beyond their walls, carrying new ideas, goods, and influences. For the Sumerians, living in the fertile lands of southern Mesopotamia, strangers came not only as visitors but as forces that shaped their destiny. Some arrived in peace with caravans of trade. Others came as migrants or conquerors, bringing both challenge and change. In this exchange of cultures, Sumer was tested, but it was also enriched. The geography of Mesopotamia made this inevitable. Open plains stretched across the land, without mountains or seas to shield the Sumerians. The Tigris and Euphrates connected them to distant peoples, while the desert and steppe brought wanderers to their gates. To live in Sumer was to live at a crossroads, exposed but also connected. And so, from early on, the Sumerians found themselves shaped by strangers. One of the earliest forms of outside influence was trade. The Sumerians, though resourceful, lacked certain vital materials. Their land offered clay in abundance, but little wood, stone, or metal. To build, to craft, to arm their defenders, they needed to look beyond their rivers. From the mountains of Anatolia came tin and copper, essential for bronze. From the forests of Lebanon came cedar wood, prized for its strength and fragrance. From the distant lands of the Indus Valley came beads, shells, and exotic goods that dazzled the Sumerians. In return, Sumer offered grain, wool, textiles, and crafted goods. The markets of Ur, Uruk, and Lagash became meeting points where local farmers stood alongside foreign traders, exchanging not just goods, but ideas. Trade introduced new tools, new fashions, and new tastes. It also encouraged the Sumerians to refine their systems of record-keeping. Clay tablets filled with tallies of goods reveal contracts between merchants, proof of how much grain was owed or how many sheep were delivered. These records show us that strangers were not simply visitors. They were woven into the economic life of Sumer. But influence came not only through peaceful exchange. North of Sumer lived the Akkadians, a Semitic-speaking people who gradually moved southward into Mesopotamia. Over time, Akkadian language and culture blended with Sumerian life. Sumerian scribes began writing in both languages, and names of Akkadian origin appeared in Sumerian records. At first, this blending was gradual, like colors merging on a painted tablet. The Akkadians admired Sumer's achievements and adopted much of its culture. They worshipped Sumerian gods, wrote in cuneiform, and built their cities in the Sumerian style. Yet they also brought their own traditions and leadership. Eventually, under the rule of Sargon of Akkad, they rose to dominate the region, creating the world's first empire. For the Sumerians, this was both a loss and a legacy. Their independence was challenged, yet their culture did not vanish. Instead, it spread further than it ever could have on its own. Through the Akkadians, Sumerian ideas, from writing to law to myth, traveled across Mesopotamia and beyond. Religion, too, was shaped by contact with others. While the Sumerians had their pantheon of gods, they were not closed to the beliefs of neighboring peoples. Strangers brought new deities, rituals, and stories, some of which merged with Sumerian traditions. For instance, certain gods of the Akkadians were equated with Sumerian ones, creating a shared divine family across cultures. This blending of faiths reflected the reality of life in Sumer's cities. In markets and temples, one might hear different languages, see different customs, and witness prayers offered in various forms. The Sumerians believed in the power of the gods to shape their destiny, and if strangers worshipped similar powers, it seemed natural to connect them. Religion became not only a source of unity within a city, but also a bridge between cultures. Yet not all encounters were peaceful. Strangers sometimes came as invaders, seeking control of the rich lands between the rivers. The Elamites from the east, the Amorites from the west, and other groups pressed against Sumer's borders. City-states, already divided by rivalries, struggled to defend themselves against these pressures. In these times, Sumerian leaders learned to adapt. Some forged alliances, marrying diplomacy with defense. Others fortified their cities, raising higher walls and training stronger armies. Strangers tested their resilience, forcing them to innovate in governance and strategy. And though Sumer sometimes fell under foreign rule, its spirit endured. Strangers brought challenges, but they also brought gifts. From the mountains and deserts came not only new goods but also new knowledge. The Sumerians learned different techniques of metallurgy, fresh methods of farming, and artistic styles that enriched their own traditions. Cylinder seals, once simple, grew more elaborate, perhaps influenced by distant designs. Myths, too, expanded, as foreign tales mingled with Sumerian stories, giving birth to legends that carried universal themes of creation, struggle, and hope. Even language itself became a bridge. Sumerian remained a prestigious tongue, the language of priests and scribes, but Akkadian grew as the common speech. Together, they created a bilingual culture, where ideas could flow across borders with greater ease. This mixture did not erase Sumer, it strengthened its reach. Through all these exchanges, one thing remained: the resilience of the Sumerian identity. Strangers could settle among them, influence their trade, shape their language, even rule their lands. But the essence of Sumer endured in its temples, its writing, and its vision of society. Their ziggurats still rose above the plains. Their cuneiform tablets still carried their words. Their myths still gave meaning to life and death. In many ways, it was the openness of the Sumerians that allowed them to survive in a world of strangers. Instead of rejecting outside influence, they absorbed it, reshaped it, and carried it forward. In doing so, they ensured that their culture would not vanish with time, but live on in the traditions of those who followed. By the end of this period, Sumer was no longer the isolated cradle of civilization it once had been. It was part of a larger network, a cultural crossroads where East met West, North met South. The Sumerians had been shaped by strangers, yes, but they had also shaped those strangers in return. Their knowledge, their stories, and their systems became the inheritance of an entire region. The story of Sumer was no longer just their own. It had become part of a shared human journey, woven into the tapestry of Mesopotamia and the world beyond. And as the Sumerians entered a new phase of their history, they stood at the threshold of growth. The challenges of strangers had tested them. The gifts of strangers had enriched them. Now, the stage was set for a period of flourishing, an age when Sumer would rise again in strength, creativity, and influence. Civilizations, like rivers, have moments when their waters run clear and strong, carrying life in every direction. For the Sumerians, such a moment came after centuries of struggle and adaptation. The challenges of their dawn and the pressures of strangers had not broken them. Instead, they had prepared them for growth. In this new age, Sumer did not simply survive, it flourished. The image of Sumer in this period is one of bustling cities, vibrant markets, ambitious rulers, and bold inventions. It was a time when human imagination seemed to stretch further than ever before, reaching into the realms of technology, politics, trade, and culture. Out of the flat plains of Mesopotamia rose a society that gave humanity some of its first great tools for living together in organized, creative ways. Perhaps nothing illustrates this flourishing better than the innovations the Sumerians left behind. Among their greatest was the perfection of writing. What had begun as simple marks for counting harvests had now evolved into a sophisticated script. Cuneiform. With wedge-shaped impressions pressed into clay, the Sumerians recorded not only lists of goods but also laws, contracts, hymns, poems, and myths. Writing became the voice of civilization, a way to preserve memory beyond the fragile span of a single human life. Through cuneiform, rulers could issue decrees, merchants could record their deals, and priests could inscribe their prayers. Schools for scribes, often attached to temples, trained young men in the art of writing, turning literacy into a respected and powerful skill. The written word gave Sumer a permanence that oral memory alone could never achieve. Other technologies, too, marked this flourishing. The wheel, already in use for pottery, was adapted for carts and wagons, transforming transportation and trade. Irrigation systems grew more complex, with canals and dikes carefully managed to feed the fields. Metallurgy advanced, with bronze tools and weapons improving efficiency and strength. In every corner of life, innovation rippled outward, touching farmers, artisans, and rulers alike. With technology came prosperity. Fields of barley swayed under the Mesopotamian sun, their harvests feeding not only the local population but also distant lands. Sumerian textiles, known for their quality, traveled far along trade routes, exchanged for the timber, metals, and stones that Sumer lacked. The cities themselves became lively centers of exchange. Markets filled with goods, clay jars of oil, baskets of dates, woolen garments, and delicate jewelry. Merchants negotiated prices, scribes tallied accounts, and travelers carried news of faraway places. Trade was not merely an economic act, it was a cultural bridge. Every exchange carried with it ideas, fashions, and stories, knitting Sumer into a wider world. The prosperity of trade also allowed rulers to commission grand projects. Temples grew taller, palaces more elaborate, and walls more imposing. These buildings were not only practical but symbolic, reminders of a city's strength and a people's devotion. As wealth increased, so did the complexity of governance. The city-states of Sumer developed new forms of leadership. The Lugal, or king, became more than a strongman. He was expected to be a shepherd of his people, responsible for justice, defense, and prosperity. Rulers built canals, organized labor, and led armies when necessary. Their authority rested on both practical ability and divine favor, for the Sumerians believed kings were chosen by the gods to guide their people. This period saw the rise of remarkable leaders whose names echo through history. Some were celebrated for building great temples, others for expanding their city's influence, and still others for inscribing laws. Their achievements, recorded in cuneiform, remind us that governance in Sumer was not a static tradition, but an evolving experiment, one that laid the foundations for later systems of law and administration. Beyond politics and economics, Sumer blossomed in culture. Music, poetry, and art flourished alongside agriculture and trade. Harps and lyres filled temples and feasts with melody. Cylinder seals, small but intricate, became not only tools of identification but also canvases of beauty, telling stories through images pressed into clay. The myths of the Sumerians deepened during this age, recorded and refined in written form. Stories of gods and heroes reflected their understanding of life, death, and the mysteries beyond. The tale of Gilgamesh, already known in oral tradition, began to take shape as one of the first great epics of humanity. Through such stories, the Sumerians expressed not only their devotion but their questions. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to live forever in memory, if not in body? This age of flourishing gave Sumer a significance far beyond its borders. For the first time in history, humans had built a network of cities, laws, writing, and trade that extended across vast regions. The Sumerians were not alone in this. Other peoples were rising in Egypt, the Indus Valley, and beyond. Yet Sumer's achievements stood at the forefront, offering the earliest examples of urban life and organized society. The influence of Sumerian innovation reached into the future. Their writing system inspired later scripts. Their legal codes set precedents for justice. Their irrigation methods were copied by generations of farmers. Even their myths traveled, reshaped and retold by cultures that followed. In many ways, the flourishing of Sumer was the flourishing of humanity itself, a step into the shared heritage of civilization. Yet, as with all golden ages, this flourishing rested on a fragile balance. Prosperity brought growth, but growth brought competition. City-states vied for resources, trade routes, and influence. Rivalries sometimes erupted into conflict, testing the unity of Sumer. And beyond their borders, other peoples watched the wealth of the southern cities with interest, waiting for their chance to share, or seize, the riches of Sumer. Still, in this moment, the energy of the Sumerians shone brightly. They had turned the challenges of their land into opportunities, the pressures of strangers into strengths, and their imagination into enduring achievements. Their flourishing was not only a chapter in their story, but a milestone in ours. To imagine Sumer in this period is to picture a landscape alive with activity. Canals shimmering in the sunlight, carts rolling through city gates, scribes bending over tablets, children reciting their lessons, priests offering prayers on high temple steps. It was a world that seemed to pulse with possibility, where every invention, every law, and every story added to the growing current of civilization. But history, like a river, does not flow evenly. After flourishing often comes turbulence, when the waters grow rough and uncertain. For the Sumerians, the strength of this age could not prevent the storms that lay ahead. Rivalries, invasions, and natural challenges would test them once again, pulling them into times of hardship. And so, from this age of flourishing, the story of Sumer would soon turn toward a period of crisis, a reminder that even the brightest civilizations must face the shadows of change. Civilizations, no matter how brilliant, are never immune to hardship. Just as rivers swell and shrink, so too do societies rise and falter. For the Sumerians, after an age of flourishing, the currents of history began to turn against them. Prosperity gave way to rivalry, abundance to scarcity, and order to uncertainty. This was the time of trouble, a period when the foundations of their cities trembled and the resilience of their people was put to the test. At the heart of Sumer's troubles were the very forces that had once made it strong. The city-states, Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, and others, had blossomed into centers of wealth and culture. Yet their closeness bred rivalry. Each city sought to control the fertile lands between the rivers, the irrigation canals, and the trade routes that sustained their prosperity. Tensions often flared into open struggle. Leaders competed not only for resources but for prestige, each wanting to prove that their patron deity was supreme. The temples of Sumer, once symbols of unity, became banners of division as cities declared their divine favor above all others. Instead of joining together in harmony, The city-states pulled apart, each building higher walls and marshaling more resources for defense. The constant cycle of rivalry strained the people. Fields were neglected as labor was diverted to building fortifications. Trade routes, once safe, became uncertain. The energy that had once flowed into temples, schools, and markets now spilled into competition and suspicion. Nature, too, played its part in Sumer's troubles. The land between the rivers was fertile but fragile. Over time, the very irrigation systems that had fed their growth began to cause problems. Poor drainage and the heavy use of canals allowed salt to accumulate in the soil. Slowly, harvests declined. Crops that had once flourished grew weaker, and fields that had once been green turned barren. This environmental challenge struck at the heart of Sumerian life. With less food came greater strain on the economy. Surpluses shrank, trade weakened, and discontent grew. Farmers bore the heaviest burdens, yet their hardship rippled through the cities, touching every level of society. To the Sumerians, these troubles were not only physical, but spiritual. They saw the decline in crops as a sign that the gods were displeased. Rituals multiplied, offerings increased, but the soil did not easily yield its strength again. In a world where divine favor was tied to survival, such troubles cut deeply into both faith and hope. Troubled times often call forth ambitious leaders, and Sumer was no exception. As cities struggled, rulers began to claim more authority, presenting themselves as protectors against chaos. The role of the Lugal expanded, no longer just a shepherd of the people, but a warrior king who could defend, command, and control. Some of these leaders brought temporary stability, forging peace treaties or organizing massive works to restore canals and fields. Others, however, pursued power more aggressively, seeking to dominate rival cities. The balance of shared culture was strained by the ambitions of those who sought to unify Sumer under a single hand, sometimes with success, but rarely with lasting peace. This centralization of power reflected a society under pressure. Where once priests had guided much of public life, now kings rose above them, claiming divine authority themselves. Temples still held influence, but the political and spiritual landscape of Sumer shifted as rulers grew stronger in times of crisis. As if internal troubles were not enough, Sumer also faced pressures from beyond its borders. The wealth of its cities drew the attention of neighboring peoples. To the east, the Elamites tested their strength against Sumerian cities. From the north and west, groups of Semitic-speaking peoples, including the Akkadians and later the Amorites, pressed into Mesopotamia. At first, these outsiders mingled and traded, but in troubled times they became competitors for land and power. The open geography of Mesopotamia offered little protection. Strangers could enter with ease, and once inside they often stayed, blending into society or rising to positions of influence. This constant flow of new peoples both enriched and destabilized Sumer, adding to the sense of uncertainty. What did these times feel like for ordinary Sumerians? For the farmer, it meant harder work in fields that yielded less. For the merchant, it meant fewer goods to sell and greater risk on trade routes. For the artisan, it meant fewer patrons to commission their work. For the priest, it meant more questions from a people anxious about the favor of the gods. And yet, life did not stop. Children still learned to read cuneiform. Families still gathered in courtyards to share meals. Festivals were still celebrated, though perhaps with fewer offerings. The resilience of daily life continued, even under strain. This persistence is part of what kept Sumer alive through its troubles. The determination of ordinary people to endure. In times of crisis, civilizations often learn lessons that shape their future. For Sumer, these lessons were hard but important. They learned that their environment demanded careful stewardship, that rivalry weakened them in the face of outsiders, and that leadership mattered most when resources grew scarce. Some cities managed to adapt, reclaiming fields, strengthening alliances, or reorganizing governance. Others faltered, their decline recorded in abandoned ruins and forgotten names. Together, these experiences left Sumer both scarred and seasoned, prepared for the transformations still to come. The period of trouble did not spell the end of Sumer, but it marked a turning point. The old balance of city-states had shifted, and new powers were rising. Foreign rulers would one day stand in Sumerian temples, and new empires would claim their legacy. But even as times grew uncertain, the core of Sumerian culture, writing, religion, myth, and memory, endured. Trouble had tested them, but it had not erased them. Like the rivers that sometimes flooded and sometimes dried, Sumer rose and fell, but always flowed forward. As the Sumerians faced these hardships, seeds of change were quietly being sown. Innovations born of necessity, adaptations in governance, and cultural resilience ensured that Sumer would not simply vanish in its troubles. Instead, it would move toward renewal, carrying its legacy into the next chapter of history. And so, from the shadows of crisis, the story of Sumer turns again, toward modernization, toward transformation, and toward the lasting mark they would leave on the world. Civilizations rarely vanish all at once. They bend, they adapt, they borrow from others, and they find ways to continue their story even after crisis. For the Sumerians, the time of trouble had shaken the foundations of their society, but it had not erased their spirit. Out of hardship emerged renewal, an age where old traditions mixed with new influences, where rulers sought to restore stability, and where the seeds of modernization were sown in the ancient soil of Mesopotamia. One of the first steps toward renewal came from the land itself. Sumerian leaders and farmers recognized that the fertility of their fields had been strained by centuries of irrigation. Salty soil and declining harvests demanded new solutions. Canals were dredged, water was redirected, and crop rotations were introduced. Barley, more resistant to salinity than wheat, became the main staple of Sumerian diets. These adjustments may seem simple, but they reflected resilience. By adapting to the land's changing conditions, the Sumerians managed to extend the life of their farmlands and keep their cities alive. The fields might never again reach the abundance of earlier centuries, but they still produced enough to sustain life and trade. Another mark of renewal was the rise of powerful rulers who claimed the authority to unify Sumer-Isis divided cities. In earlier times, each city-state had guarded its independence, but now the troubles of the past had shown the cost of rivalry. Ambitious kings stepped forward, presenting themselves as unifiers who could bring peace, rebuild canals, and protect against external threats. Among these leaders, none stood taller than Ur-Nammu, the founder of the third dynasty of Ur around 2100 BCE. Ur-Nammu presented himself not only as a warrior, but as a lawgiver and builder. He is remembered for commissioning one of the earliest known law codes, a collection of rules meant to create fairness and stability in society. By codifying justice, he brought a sense of order to people weary of conflict and uncertainty. Under his rule and that of his successors, Ur flourished once more. Temples were rebuilt, trade revived, and monumental projects such as the Great Ziggurat of Ur rose to the skies, testifying to the renewed confidence of the Sumerians. This period also saw innovations in governance and administration. The Sumerians refined their systems of record-keeping, expanding the use of cuneiform not only for trade but for taxes, labor assignments, and laws. Bureaucracies grew more sophisticated, ensuring that resources were distributed and that projects like irrigation were properly maintained. The relationship between kings and temples also evolved. Where once priests had dominated public life, now rulers asserted more direct authority, often claiming divine favor themselves. Yet the temples remained important, serving as both spiritual centers and economic hubs. The blend of religion and politics gave rulers both legitimacy and practical means to guide their cities. Trade, too, revived during this period of modernization. Though agriculture remained the backbone of the economy, Sumerian merchants expanded their networks once again, Caravans traveled westward towards Syria and Canaan, while ships crossed the Persian Gulf to connect with lands as far as the Indus Valley. The exchange was more than material. Along with goods came ideas, new technologies, artistic influences, and cultural practices. Sumerian merchants brought home precious stones, metals, and timber while spreading their own innovations, such as writing and measurement systems, across distant lands. In this way, Sumer's renewal was not only local but global, as they reconnected with the broader currents of the ancient world. Periods of renewal are often times of creativity, and Sumer was no exception. The challenges of crisis had taught them the importance of adaptation, and their ingenuity blossomed in new ways. They refined their mathematics, developing systems of calculation that would influence later civilizations. They advanced in astronomy, carefully observing the skies to track time and seasons. Their writing system, cuneiform, became more versatile, used not only for economic records but for literature, hymns, and epics. It was in this renewed age that stories like the Epic of Gilgamesh took written form, preserving Sumerian myths and wisdom for generations to come. These texts were not only cultural treasures but also symbols of endurance, proof that even after hardship the Sumerians could still dream, imagine, and create. The peak of this renewal came under the Ur-III period, sometimes called the Sumerian Renaissance. The city of Ur became the jewel of Mesopotamia, boasting monumental temples, thriving markets, and grand palaces. Its ziggurat, dedicated to the moon god Nana, stood as a towering symbol of faith and power, visible for miles across the flat plains. For the citizens of Ur, life may have felt stable once more. Farmers harvested barley, merchants bustled in markets, scribes filled clay tablets, and priests conducted rituals in gleaming temples. After the uncertainty of earlier centuries, this age of renewal must have seemed like a return to the blessings of the gods. Yet renewal is never without its limits. Even as Ur thrived, new powers were stirring beyond Sumer's borders. The Amorites to the west and the Elamites to the east would soon test Sumer's strength once again. The geography that had once made Sumer a crossroads of culture also left it vulnerable to outside forces. But the fragility of renewal does not lessen its value. For generations, the Sumerians had proven their resilience, adapting to environmental changes, reorganizing their society, and finding ways to flourish again. Even as the winds of history began to shift, their legacy grew stronger, carried forward by those who admired and adopted their achievements. The period of modernization was not a return to the Sumer of old, but the creation of something new. Sumer had been transformed by its struggles, and in renewal, it blended old traditions with fresh ideas. This ability to adapt, to change while still preserving identity, is one of the great strengths of any civilization. In law, in governance, in technology, and in culture, the Sumerians shaped a foundation upon which later empires would build. Though their independence as city-states would not last forever, their spirit of innovation ensured that their influence would echo through the ages. As the sun set over the ziggurat of Ur and the fields of barley ripened once again, the Sumerians may not have known they were living in their final golden age. But history remembers their renewal as a testament to their resilience, proof that even after crisis, a civilization can rise again with strength and creativity. The next chapter in their story would not be one of decline alone, but of transformation into something larger. For in the grand stage of history, the Sumerians were preparing to hand their legacy to new powers, ensuring that their voice would continue long after their cities had faded. When a civilization fades, its walls crumble and its streets fall silent, one might think its story ends. Yet some civilizations leave behind more than ruins. They leave ideas, inventions, and systems so enduring that the world itself is reshaped. The Sumerians were such a people. Though their cities eventually yielded to new empires, their legacy became the foundation upon which much of human history was built. To understand the world today is in many ways to recognize the footprints of Sumer. Perhaps the most extraordinary of their contributions was the creation of writing. What began as simple marks on clay to record goods and trade blossomed into cuneiform, one of humanity's first written languages. With wedge-shaped impressions pressed into soft clay tablets, the Sumerians turned fleeting words into lasting records. This revolutionized society. Merchants could track transactions, rulers could issue decrees, and priests could preserve hymns to the gods. But writing went beyond administration. It gave birth to literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its tales of kings, friendship, and the search for immortality, stands as one of the earliest masterpieces of human imagination. Through writing, the Sumerians ensured that their voices would echo across thousands of years. From writing came another profound gift: the rule of law. The Sumerians were among the first to codify justice. Before law codes, disputes were settled by custom, memory, or the whim of local leaders. But with written laws, society gained consistency and fairness. One of the earliest known law codes, attributed to Ur-Nammu of Ur, set out rules and penalties in clear terms. This principle influenced later civilizations, from the Babylonians to the Hebrews, and eventually shaped the very foundations of modern legal systems. The Sumerians also gave the world the model of the city. Before them, humans had lived in villages and small settlements. But in Sumer, places like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash grew into bustling urban centers with tens of thousands of inhabitants. Here, temples rose above markets, walls encircled neighborhoods, and streets bustled with merchants, artisans, and scribes. Specialized labor allowed for innovation. Potters, metalworkers, priests, and administrators each contributing to a complex society. The idea of the city, with its organized streets, central government, and cultural life, spread outward. Nearly every great civilization that followed, from Babylon to Athens, from Rome to the cities of today, owes something to the Sumerian blueprint of urban living. Sumer was also a land of inventions. Necessity, born from both abundance and hardship, fueled their creativity. Among their technological contributions, the wheel, first used for pottery, later transformed transport and trade. The plow, making agriculture more efficient and harvests more reliable. Irrigation systems, channeling river waters to sustain large populations. Mathematics, including a base 60 system that gave us the concept of 60 minutes in an hour and 360 degrees in a circle. These innovations were not just clever ideas, they were practical tools that shaped human life. The wheel and plow expanded horizons, while mathematics and astronomy allowed for calendars, construction, and navigation. Much of the framework of science and daily living today rests upon these early achievements. Beyond practical inventions, the Sumerians also shaped the way humanity understood itself and the cosmos. Their religious worldview, with gods tied to the forces of nature and the order of society, influenced later civilizations deeply. They saw life as a partnership with divine powers. Temples, or ziggurats, stood as bridges between heaven and earth. Myths like that of the flood, found in Sumerian stories, later echoed in other cultures and sacred texts. By writing their myths, they preserved not only beliefs but also questions that continue to resonate. Why do we suffer? What is the meaning of mortality? How should humans live in harmony with the divine? In this way, their stories were not only about gods but about humanity itself. The Sumerians pioneered forms of economic and political organization that shaped later empires. Their use of standardized weights and measures enabled fair trade. Their development of taxation supported public works like canals and temples. Politically, their city-states experimented with leadership, from assemblies of elders to powerful kings. Though often contested, these experiments laid groundwork for ideas about governance, justice, and civic duty. Even the tensions between temple authority and royal power foreshadowed debates about church and state that would appear in much later history. The Sumerians themselves did not last forever. Their language eventually faded, absorbed by Akkadian, and their cities fell to new empires. Yet their influence traveled far beyond their borders. The Babylonians adopted and expanded their systems of law and writing. The Assyrians carried their myths and mathematics. Traders carried their ideas westward, where echoes of Sumerian thought appeared in the Mediterranean world. Even the Greeks and Romans, centuries later, inherited concepts that traced back to Mesopotamia's first great nation. In truth, the Sumerians never vanished. Their memory was embedded in every culture that touched the fertile land between the rivers. Today, when we measure time in 60 minutes, when we trace the history of written law, when we read stories of ancient kings seeking wisdom, we are walking in the shadow of Sumer. They may not be as famous as Egypt's pyramids or Rome's legions, but their fingerprints are everywhere. They were the hidden architects of civilization, the people who turned clay into text, rivers into harvests, and myths into literature. Even if their name faded for centuries, their influence never did. As the Sumerians handed their world to the Akkadians, Babylonians, and countless others, they also handed down a toolkit, a set of ideas, inventions, and systems that others could refine. This is their true legacy. Not a single monument, but the very framework of civilization itself. And so, though their cities lie in ruins and their language is silent, their legacy remains alive in the ways we live, think, and dream. Civilizations are like voices in a great chorus of history. Some sing loudly for centuries, while others are heard only for a brief moment. Yet even the quietest voices leave echoes, carrying across time to inspire and remind us of what once was. The Sumerians were such a voice. Though their cities crumbled and their language fell silent, their presence remains, not as ruins alone, but as living echoes in our daily lives and collective memory. For centuries after their decline, the Sumerians seemed lost to history. Their cities were buried beneath layers of earth, their language unreadable, their very name forgotten. Ancient scribes of later empires remembered fragments, myths of old kings, names of cities, whispers of ancient gods. But the identity of Sumer as the first great civilization was obscured. It was only in the 19th century, when archaeologists uncovered clay tablets in Mesopotamia, that their story began to re-emerge. Scholars puzzled over strange wedge-shaped marks until they realized they were looking at cuneiform, the written voice of Sumer. Slowly, piece by piece, their history was revealed. Their laws, their prayers, their contracts, their stories. The rediscovery of Sumer was like hearing an ancient voice calling across thousands of years, reminding the world of its forgotten beginnings. The lessons of Sumer. What can we learn from the Sumerians today? Their story offers more than curiosity, it offers perspective. They remind us that innovation begins with necessity. Out of rivers and mud, they invented writing, cities, and law, not for luxury, but for survival. They remind us that civilizations are fragile. Rivalries, environmental strain, and outside pressures can undo even the strongest societies. They remind us that legacy is not measured in walls, but in ideas. While their bricks crumbled, their systems of time, writing, and governance endured. The Sumerians teach us that greatness lies not in permanence, but in the ability to shape what comes after. Yet, remembering the Sumerians is also a challenge. Unlike the pyramids of Egypt or the temples of Greece, their ruins are less dramatic, their monuments weathered by time. Much of what we know comes from fragments of clay tablets and reconstructed histories. Their story, in many ways, had to be rediscovered and retold. This reminds us of a deeper truth, that memory itself is fragile. If stories are not passed on, they fade. If names are not spoken, they vanish. The Sumerians stand as both a warning and an inspiration, that we must preserve the stories of those who came before, for in them lies the wisdom of humanity. Even so, Sumer is not gone. Their echoes live in the rhythm of our daily lives. When we glance at a clock and measure time in hours and minutes, we are using the mathematics of Sumer. When we walk through a city with its organized streets and public spaces, we are inhabiting their vision of urban life. When we study literature, law, or astronomy, we are following paths they helped to carve. Their gods may no longer be worshipped, their language no longer spoken, but their fingerprints are everywhere. In this sense, the Sumerians are not only a memory of the past, but companions of the present. As archaeologists continue to unearth tablets and ruins, new details of Sumer's story come to light. Each discovery is like a whisper from the past, deepening our understanding of who they were. But beyond uncovering facts, there is a greater responsibility, to reflect on how their story shapes our own. The Sumerians faced challenges that are strikingly familiar: environmental change, political rivalries, the balance of power and faith. Their rise and decline remind us that civilizations are both creative and vulnerable, resilient and fragile. Their story is not just ancient history, it is a mirror in which we can glimpse the possibilities and dangers of our own world. In the end, the story of the Sumerians is not one of disappearance, but of transformation. Their name may have been forgotten for centuries, but their contributions became part of the foundation of civilization itself. They live on in the very fabric of human progress, woven into the way we write, measure, build, and dream. The echo of Sumer is not a distant murmur, but a living rhythm, carried in every innovation that followed, in every law that governs, in every story that seeks meaning. They remind us that no civilization is truly lost if its legacy continues to shape the world. As we close the story of the Sumerians, we see them not as an isolated people of long ago, but as part of the great chorus of humanity. Their voice, though ancient, still sings in harmony with ours. It is a voice of beginnings, of the first city, the first law, the first epic. It is a voice of resilience, of people who endured crisis and sought renewal. And it is a voice of legacy, a reminder that what we build today may echo long after we are gone. The Sumerians remind us that time may try to erase a nation, but memory, curiosity, and human connection can bring it back. And so, their story does not end in silence. It continues, carried forward by all who listen, learn, and pass it on. And so, as the dust of time settles over the land of Sumer, we pause for a moment of reflection. These ancient people, though long gone, left traces that whisper to us across thousands of years. Their voices may be faint, yet their ideas live on in the world we know today. This chapter is just one step in a larger journey through the rise, the struggles, and the enduring legacy of the Sumerians. As we close this episode, let your mind rest gently with the thought that history is not only about what is past, but about what continues to live within us. Join me again as we open the next page of this timeless story.